Hey, everybody. This is Meg Riley here in Minneapolis, and you've joined us for another episode of The VUU. Before we introduce special guests, I'd like to invite any of the regulars to introduce yourselves. Aisha, you want to start?
Hi, I'm Aisha Hauser, and today I'm in Bellevue, Washington. I actually came into the office super early so I can have quiet, so I'm not in my house with 2 dogs, 2 teenagers, and a husband.
Hi, I'm Joanna Fontaine Crawford, and I'm here in Austin, Texas.
Good morning, everyone. This is Michael TIno joining you from Peekskill, New York.
Hi, everyone. This is Terri Burnor in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I will be live tweeting this episode, as I always do, using the hashtag TheVUU, VUU.
This is our last episode before we take a summer break, so we're especially excited to have 2 guests that we all read everything that they write, and so we're really excited to get to talk to them as well. We have Nathan Ryan, who is a minister in Baton Rouge from Louisiana, and we have Kimberly Hampton, who is in St. Louis, and I've known you with a variety of hats on, so I'm not sure which one you're wearing today. One of them is that she knows everything about St. Louis, and when I was in St. Louis, I asked her a lot of questions. What's your official title these days, Kimberly?
I'm still a ministerial candidate, so however long that lasts.
Okay. Well, and a great blogger as well. So we're here to talk about the crises that come up in all of our communities, about racism, about police murders of people. Here in Minneapolis, as we speak today, we are all really nervous the longer the jury deliberates about the killing of Philando Castile, which in my opinion should have taken them 5 minutes because it was so obvious what happened. But when I read the biographies of the juries, I thought, we're never going to get a conviction. And we've seen it happen all over the country. Foundationally, I think, with the emergence of the Black Lives Matters movement and response, Kimberly Ferguson, you want to start us there and talk about, I think, not everything that happened, but how you saw Unitarian Universalism show up and not show up, what you would have wished for, what you experienced, and now we're coming up on the 3rd anniversary of that, right? Do I have my years right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, what have you seen over time?
As far as Unitarian Universalism and Ferguson is concerned, I haven't seen much. That's the locals is one thing, but the rest of the movement is a different one. I'm actually at the point where I'm not sure Unitarian Universalism knows where St. Louis is on a map, because that's how silent institutional Unitarian Universalism was in the wake of Ferguson. The locals, however, have been on it, some of us before, but especially in the days directly after. Like Julie Taylor was on the ground, on the streets in Ferguson, almost from August 9th on. And she always tells me I give her too much credit that she wasn't out there every day. And I'm like, okay, yeah, you missed 3. But other than that, there's been a noticeable absence. And it's not just here in Ferguson. There didn't seem to be a national response when it came to Tamir Rice being shot in Cleveland, nor the response to the decision to no true bill Pantaleo in Staten Island with the death of Eric Garner, and all of these things happened within 3 months of each other. So it was just like, okay, I might give you a pass for missing St. Louis, but it just was a continual cycle of missing the point. And it's like, this is the movement. This is what's happening. There are UUs on the ground. It would help if we had a little support.
What would support look like? Have you thought about that, or has it just been like anything would be such a big step up?
Well, we had the St. Louis UU ministers had asked for essentially an all hands on deck call when Ferguson October came, which was 2 months after Mike was killed. And that never happened. So I don't think we were asking for much. And it's just basics like, okay, what do you need? What's coming up? Who can we put you in contact with if you need that kind of thing? And that just seemed to be non-existent.
Yeah, and Nathan Ryan here from Baton Rouge, you have your own, I mean, we all do. There isn't a community around without one of these horror stories, but you had one that got a lot of national attention. Do you want to catch us up on that and what, if any, response you experienced from Unitarian Universalists?
Yeah, so my story is complicated. And we had a killing of a black man by police in 2014. A man named Victor White, who was handcuffed in the back of a police car and found shot dead with a shotgun to the chest, and they ruled that a suicide. And the DOJ looked into it and said, yeah, we don't have enough evidence. But no one knew his name, and his family couldn't even go to DC when there were major protests there because they couldn't afford it. So I was ready for Louisiana to be completely ignored like it usually is. So July 5th, this summer, Alton Sterling was shot about just a few miles from the church by 2 officers. Turns out one of the officers in April had also pinned down and beaten a black kid during an Earth Day festival. So there were protests here for about a week, and then after, I guess, 10 days, and the police just acting completely foolish, some guy came down and shot and killed 3 officers while we were having worship service in the neighborhood of the church. And we were actually told the neighborhood was on lockdown. People couldn't get to the church, and people couldn't. And then 3 weeks later, I think we had about 40 inches of rain, and 30 to 40% of all Baton Rouge and 90% of the nearby parishes all flooded, which was more than almost $20 billion worth of damage. So it's been one hell of a year for us here.
And when your posts, I think the thing that was most striking to me was how alone, here in Minneapolis, there are 12 churches and 30 to 40 ministers around. And it really felt like the people there, in terms of leadership from Unitarian Universalism, were stretched so thin, very few of you.
So there's a complicated answer to that. When Katrina hit, New Orleans did get a lot of attention, and the Baton Rouge Church did a lot of work with Katrina recovery. In 2009, when Gustav turned away from New Orleans and smashed Baton Rouge, and people lost power for 2 weeks or so, no one noticed. And that's sort of the story of Baton Rouge. And when Victor White was shot and no one noticed, we were pretty used to that. And people noticed when Alton Sterling was shot. So that was actually news for us, that people paid attention. And then when the flood happened, no one noticed again. We had more rain in one weekend than Dallas had in an entire year. I don't want to say no one showed up. We got calls and letters and things from Unitarians all over the country. More than $50,000 were donated to flood relief just to Unitarians by Unitarians. And most people still don't know the story, which is what we've been asking for. So, it was, and the lay of the land is there's 3 churches in New Orleans. They total about 200 members. The Baton Rouge Church is 470. We have a senior minister who's been here 35 years, who most people don't even know his name, which is Steve Crump. And he's done maybe the best ministry I've ever seen. and he doesn't get credit. So
yeah, I was UUA staff on the Katrina recovery, and Steve Crump and Baton Rouge were absolutely central to that. I think what was so striking in the Katrina recovery that would be true in Baton Rouge too is that there's the flood, and then there's all of the dynamics that are there before, during, and after a natural disaster of poverty and racism and violence and oppression, and that kind of support, and thinking through who to support that the Red Cross doesn't get to, and really looking at the issues of oppression in a natural disaster. It sounds like that nobody nationally paid attention to that after the.
Well, and I think there's also a whole issue of taking care of our own and so and defining our own very narrowly, right? A UU who is in a church. This was with Hurricane Katrina. I was the webmaster and was creating a whole thing because there were so many UUs around the country saying we want to help, and the region or district back then made the decision of no, only UUs. And so I don't think that we actually wound up, in terms of like, giving someone shelter, I don't think we gave a single person shelter.
Wow, I didn't know that was you, Joanna. I remember that person trying to do that. Yeah, that was an interesting study in UU gatekeeping. And I think as we change leadership, and as we especially lift up white supremacy so centrally in this particular leadership change, I think looking at how we respond and who us is just absolutely central. I mean, the worst days of my life, really professionally, were the calls I got from irate people that we were giving money to other people in the Gulf Coast and not channeling it all into those 200 Unitarian Universalists. We had $3.5 million. There were people dying, that were not Unitarian Universalists, and people were irate that we were not, putting that money into buildings and for the Unitarian Universalists when there were people on the street dying, So those conversations, I think, about who gets to decide and how decisions are made, and transparency. We didn't do some things super well up front with transparency. We didn't say 2/3 of the money goes to the people who need it most. And there were people who were very angry that they wouldn't have given money, I guess, if they'd known that. And, yeah, I think that whole structure, I'm really interested in how we could be poised for some response. Michael, you're not in New York City, but you weren't that far from Eric Garner. Did you see any response there that was not just like?
I think that, the New York metro area, there's a similar dynamic to what you see in the Twin Cities. When there were districts, there was a whole district of UU congregations within commuting distance of New York City, right? So the Metro New York district was 50-something congregations, and probably 100 ministers, including community ministers and all. And so there's not a sense that we felt alone because we all were attending the demonstrations together. But I definitely agree with what Kimberly and Nathan has said about kind of the lack of, it's not even attention, because New York, everyone pays attention to New York. The nightly news comes to you from New York. If you sit down to watch the nightly news, you see my skyline. So it's not even attention, but just sort of the lack of solidarity. I'll put it that way. That Unitarian Universalists across the nation could have been showing and not to other Unitarian Universalists, but to the community to the Black community in New York, who were reeling from Eric Garner's death and who were aghast that the officer that killed him with a chokehold was not even indicted, or that the DA the Staten Island DA wouldn't even bring it to a grand jury. So it's, and I think so. So I think we saw a very similar thing happen here. It's just since we're so not alone because we have so many people. I hate to say we didn't care, but I think that the larger question is, how do Unitarian Universalists show up for in solidarity with communities of color, like Julie did in Ferguson, but institutionally and not individually. Go ahead, Aisha.
So everyone's been talking, I've been thinking about the teach-in and why the white supremacy teaching got so much traction, good and bad. I mean, there's definitely been and still continues to be a lot of just strong feelings. I mean, a teach-in about anti-racism would not have gotten this much attention. So one of the things that I was most inspired by was both Kimberly's blog posts and Nathan's, not only your post, Nathan, but your letter to the UUA board, that it actually made me cry because I had a particularly difficult interaction here at my congregation, because there are quite a few white people angry at me at the words white supremacy, especially in the beginning. And it reminded me why I'm doing this. You said you laid out so beautifully, Nathan, to the UUA board. It was after Lena Gardner's post asking folks, and you said, probably more than any other faith, Unitarian Universalism owes the Black community because of, you even made reference to how many endowments that New England churches have. Probably, you can trace back to money made by slave labor, slavery. So how we're showing up, I think maybe we're just starting to with the teach-in nationally to grapple with this incredibly difficult conversation, with the money that the Board of Trustees, the commitment to help Blue fundraise $5 million and people's reaction to that. And I do want to say, not just people, one of the things that's been most startling to me is how many people in positions of power and authority, and I will say with ministers, white ministers, that I've been disappointed in their not just resistance, but anger and hostility to this work. And I do think it would be valuable for us to talk about the Southern Baptist Convention and their vote to, Kimberly's laughing, to decry white supremacy, or what is it? They voted to, what did they vote to do? To
basically
condemn white supremacy, right?
Well, not white supremacy writ large. They're talking about the alt-right. They're talking about white supremacists. And they could barely get there, but they're talking in a very narrow way about, it's a very different conversation.
And that's what I thought, because people were, commenting as they were posting like, oh, well, I hope our faith can get there. I said, well, our faith is having a different conversation. We're looking at it ourselves because we're recognizing that we are a part of this system. We're not separate from it. So I almost want to say I dare say we're a teeny weeny bit, I don't want to say ahead. We're in a different place because
it's a different conversation. I think if we wanted to pass a resolution saying that the KKK sucks, we could get there without any argument, right? But they couldn't. They couldn't do that. But so we're that far ahead, I think we could. It would depend on how the words were on the page, though, right?
Can you all hear me? It's a different conversation, but only by degree. Partly because the only reason the SBC exists is because the Baptists, way back when, they split over the issue of slavery. The Unitarians were too small, number one, to split, but also because New England is New England, we don't talk about those things. And so what's in our DNA is a little different than what's in their DNA.
Well, and if I could add to that, there's two things. One, Aisha, you said this is difficult. I don't think it's difficult. It's pretty simple to look at. And two, we never had to split over slavery because we never put churches where there was slavery because we were so proud of ourselves that we didn't have, that we weren't at all benefiting from the enslavement of an entire group of people. So the Southern Baptists have their own conversation. And I think what inspired whatever it is I wrote that Aisha liked is we have I grew up in Louisiana, and I always knew that we were all racist down here. And so I knew I had two choices as a racist. And I knew that because I was in Louisiana, and I had validation to prove it. When I was 12, half the white adults that I grew up around voted for David Duke to be their governor. He was the grand wizard of the KKK. So we have a different conversation than a lot of the country. But I always knew we were the racist here. And I had two choices. I could either give up and just be racist too, or leave Louisiana and not be like all of the other racists. And that mythology has been alive in our country since its founding. And Unitarian Universalism, since it's essentially the founders of this country, have that problem too. And so, we didn't have to worry about, you can't talk about the UUA hiring stuff right now without talking about the history of this country. So we didn't, Massachusetts and New England Unitarians didn't have to worry about slavery because they didn't have to see it, but they still got the benefit. And the really interesting part, down here, there's the super rich plantation owners, there's the incredibly impoverished white people because they couldn't get jobs because it was all enslaved labor, and then the enslaved black people. Whereas when the money went up to our Unitarians, it went to factory towns and to textile industries where the money got distributed. So we have a lot of the poverty you see here, you saw with Katrina and you see with this flood, from this country's continued desire not to look at it. And we're at the center of that. Southern Baptists, they've got a whole different conversation. They're talking about race because they don't want to talk about gay stuff. We'll talk about gay stuff because we don't want to talk about race.
Well,
and if I can jump back in real quick, I think Nathan's being very kind to New England in a way he doesn't have to be, because as much as there might not have been direct issue with slavery, there was slavery in Massachusetts until 1786, 1787. Harvard had been around 150 years by that point. There were slaves at Harvard. Brown University, the reason Brown University exists, Yale exists because slavery was around. And all these places in New England have direct ties to slavery. It's just, we couch it in pretty language. And we don't want to talk about the fact that there were slaves in Harvard Yard, or that there were slaves in the middle of Yale Yard. There was Calhoun House at Yale. So slavery is intimate to New England. It's just that they couch it in pretty language. And so I don't think Nathan needs to be as kind to New England as he's being.
And I think that if we had a resolution that said that congregations whose endowments are a result of the slave trade should give their endowments to communities of color, I don't think that resolution would pass. So, so let's just be clear. If we said, "Oh, here's the way we're still complicit in the enslavement of African and African American people," I think we'd have a hard time bringing that resolution to the floor, and we'd certainly have a hard time passing it.
And there's another layer to it too. One of the ways that we've been able to perpetuate this "we're not them, we're us" stuff is politically. We always talk of, where the places where all the Unitarians would love to live. We pick on poor Portland, but that's the white supremacist capital of America in some ways. And I don't remember us throwing a fit when we went to Portland 2 years ago as a General Assembly in the way that we're throwing a fit right now when we're going to New Orleans. So when, when we talk about, what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that when we use partisan politics to avoid, we can use partisan politics to avoid talking about race, and then we can feel better about ourselves because, I did a really interesting game where I took any really partisan article that used the words blue and red and changed the word red to black and blue to white. And it's not entirely true, but all of the South is majority black, or the highest proportion of black in the country. And the racism shows up much more clearly than it did when it was red and blue.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so red states are the takers, blue states are the makers. Red states are the ones that take all the tax money, because they're all conservatives. And with the secret bizarre code is that's where the black people live. They're the ones who are taking the money. But us in Massachusetts, us in the Pacific Northwest, we produce the most tax revenue without looking at why some areas of the country are impoverished and some aren't. And so there's almost this individual absolution to say, well, after the flood, I can't tell you how many people, I don't want to tell you because the number is greater than zero, but how many people said, well, y'all wouldn't have flooded if you weren't a red state. You got what was coming to you. And what they really meant was you're a black state.
Interesting. So when you say people are saying with the red and blue, you're talking about liberal talk.
Right. Yeah. The way that white liberals can tend to feel better about themselves. Yeah. Look at the 10 most liberal cities or the ideal liberal whatevers, and then look at the racial demographics.
Yeah, Minneapolis wins all these awards as the most livable city, the best jobs, this and that. And blacks make 38 cents to the dollar what whites do. So it's like two different cities. Every measure that you have around race, we're like Mississippi. I mean, we honest to God are. But people think of it as a very liberal, livable, white people do. And all the white media and, getting that other story out is hard.
Oh, Seattle is, nope. When I came here, I've been here now, so I'm going to be my 4th year. I had this whole image of what Seattle would be because of how liberal I understood it to be. It was named the gayest friendly city, even beyond San Francisco, and I think that's true. Race-wise, the schools have been under federal oversight because of how the disparity. The police, I think, are just coming out from being investigated because of issues, and housing is simply unaffordable. It's startling how liberal, but what I say is liberal, but not progressive. I mean, progressive in the environment, we have food garbage, but not when it comes to race at all.
Well, and to just pretend that there's only two things, you're either red or blue, you're either liberal or conservative, lets us ignore race. We had in Baton Rouge, every black member of the city council walked out, and the paper covered it by saying all the Democrats walked out. So, we can use race to avoid, we can use partisanism to avoid looking at what's really going on.
Well, you watch something like the movie The 13th, and nobody looks very good. I mean, Clinton looks horrible. And it's much, or, Obama being the deporter in chief. I mean, we would much rather that it was simpler than it is, but it's complicated. So do you think that the southern part of this, do you think that the UUA has particular ignoring of the South, or is this just kind of, I'm curious if there's a southern piece of this. And Nathan, you said something about people complaining about coming to Baton Rouge, to New Orleans. about the weather, I've heard. I haven't heard anybody complaining about anything else. What did you mean by that?
So there was discussions of making New Orleans a justice GA. I think it's no surprise, and the question that I asked other ministers from New Orleans about this is, they said, well, what's happened in New Orleans, like sort of what happened in Phoenix, that now all of a sudden makes it a justice GA? And so the planning committee moved away from that, which I appreciate. But I don't think it's a surprise that all of this race stuff is coming up when the UUA is coming to New Orleans. I see people come down here all the time. So this may not sound like it's about race, but it is. Let's talk about Mardi Gras beads for a second. So everyone in Louisiana gets Mardi Gras beads because they show up at parades, and then rich people who've paid literally tens of thousands of dollars to buy beads just throw them to the parade goers. Most people have an idea that when you go to New Orleans, you have to either pay for the beads or expose yourself for the beads or do some sort of non-monetary exchange to get them. Whereas in Louisiana, it's just part of it's a collectivist culture rather than individualist culture. So people come to Louisiana and they're not able to see what Louisiana is. They only see what they fear about where they're from, their Calvinist backgrounds or their cultural repressions or whatever it is. And then when they come down here, it becomes this whole crazy reflecting, mirror reflecting pond to see what bothers them about themselves, if that makes sense.
I'm not quite there. I'd love to hear more. I mean, because we're all coming there. So, I've never thought much about Mardi Gras beads one way or another. So I'd love, I've never bought any. People give them to me all the time, but I've never culturally thought anything except, boy, people down here like Mardi Gras beads. So I would like more help to be culturally sensitive when I'm there.
So people will come here and they're going to see some of the most obtuse racism they've ever seen. But they see that because they don't want to see the racism where they are. So you're going to see more black people than you've probably ever seen. Not you, Meg, but you probably anyone. More black people than you may ever see here. And they're going to act like every stereotype and defy every stereotype that you could ever have. Just because there's so many. And, it's easy to see all the problems here. So poor Deanna in New Orleans, she runs the Center for Ethical Living. And her job, it's absolutely brilliant. She brings people in, her and Ruth together, bring people in to do Katrina work, and they work on race and do some New Orleans recovery, and then they go home. But what Deanna gets every single week is Monday, the group comes in, they say, we're here to help you with your race problem. We don't have a problem where we live because we don't have black people. And so then Deanna has to spend the whole week working with them to say, all right, let's explore why you don't have black people where you live. Let's explore what this is. And then at the end of the week, they go home, and on Monday, she has another group come and say the exact same thing. So we're very used to that down here.
And if I can jump in, it's partly that America doesn't like to talk about its own history. We like to talk about everybody else's history. We like to talk about everybody else's problems and everybody else's issues. And we can't, I'm so with Nathan on feeling for Deanna, because I think she handles, excuse me for the way I'm getting ready to say this, you good liberal white folk, she handles you all better than I ever could. And it is, to me, just the basic rank ignorance most Americans have about our country and its implications going forward. Because there's a reason so many UUs have no encounters with black people. It has everything to do with housing patterns. But in order to talk about housing patterns, you actually have to talk about FHA and the GI Bill and what happened during the Depression and post-World War II. You can't talk about America and its racial issues and not talk about the Great Depression, World War II, and all the things we did after that. And yet, if you ask most people why their neighborhoods look, they have absolutely no idea. Or they'll say, oh, you know, we picked this because it had good schools. Well, guess what? There's a reason for that. Because we had schools related to property tax values. And the way you get better property tax values is to not have Black people in your neighborhood. Because back in were thrown out, we started redlining, and that was federal policy. So this isn't by accident. None of this is by accident. That Black people live where they live because of federal policy, and white people live where they live because of federal policy. And until we actually start talking about the ways in which policy has become the means in which these things happen, nothing will change.
And if I could add to that, Kimberly, that part of the way we don't have to look at housing discrimination is to say, oh, well, we didn't have segregated schools. The South had segregated schools because they had Jim Crow, not us. And there's another layer to it. So we, by making the South the identified patient, we can avoid looking at our own racism. And it's interesting. The reason I see it this way is because, you know, when I moved away in 2002, and I moved to Texas and then DC, people always said, oh, you're from New Orleans, where's your accent? And it didn't occur to me at the time. I mean, part of it is New Orleans has a more Boston, New York accent, so people aren't even hearing what they're listening for. But part of it was, you don't sound as ignorant or racist as I thought you were. And to hear that constantly, and to know that my accent, or the accent of white people where I'm from, is a stand-in for racism and for ignorance and for hatred, you know, that has a really strange impact on white Southerners. You know, I can't tell you how many people where I'm from have told me, I mean, where I serve in this church, have told me I had to intentionally lose my accent for people to take me seriously.
Would you know that I grew up in West Virginia from listening to me? I got it beat out of me. I'll tell you, I moved to Ohio and I got it bullied out of me. I did not want to talk like a Southerner.
Can I, because thank you. Oh, this is such a great conversation, because one of the actually more recent posts just in the last couple of weeks, there was a Facebook conversation about among folks who were still upset about the words white supremacy, and someone saying, well, I really can't decenter whiteness because my congregation's, you know, 99% white, and two different people, one in New England and one in New Mexico, which used to be Mexico. But anyway, we're talking about how they had no interest or reason to decenter whiteness. And this conversation right here, I want to clip it and put it into that thread and say, you didn't become all white by accident. This was by design. So that's the first step, is how did a congregation in New Mexico or in the middle of Massachusetts become and remain all white? That's right there, even having that recognition, instead of saying, well, I don't need to do this work because we don't have any Black or brown people here. So thank you for that. And I just felt the need to say that.
I don't think this is that hard. All we really have to say is there are different cultures, and different cultures talk and act differently. And our country put some people at the expense of others. They told white people, if you behave yourselves, we won't treat you like we treat Black people. I mean, if we just acknowledge that, you know, and to say Southern Black dialect is different than Northern Black dialect, and Southwestern Louisiana white dialect is different than Southeastern Louisiana white dialect, and they're not better or worse, they're just different. And to stop sort of this whole, there's nothing to be scared of, I think.
But there could be something to be scared of. And I'm half playing devil's advocate. If you actually acknowledge the fact that none of this happened by accident, then you have to ask yourself the question, well, what do I do about it? And let's be frank about most Unitarian Universalists. You're comfortable in your white world. Your white world is going fine. It's going great. And so you don't have to worry about your son or your daughter when they walk out of the house, whether they're going to get stopped by a policeman and are going to end up dead on the street and people will be able to see them for 4.5 hours. This just does not enter your consciousness. You don't have to worry about whether your child, when they walk into their school, is 6 times more likely to be placed in special ed just because of the color of their skin. You don't have to worry about whether your son or your daughter is going to get expelled for something that some little white kid does. So it could be hard because it then requires you to actually think about the ways in which not just your ooey gooey, I'm so not racist feelings don't really matter in this. That what matters is policy and your complicity in policy and letting things go, in not challenging police when they sit up and blatantly lie about stuff when we have it on videotape. And yet we can count the number of officers who've been not just indicted, but convicted on maybe 2 hands. So it becomes the acknowledgement that, well, yeah, Southeast Louisiana is different than Southwest Louisiana. Yeah, that's true. But what does that mean? And for a lot of people who are really comfortable in their worlds, to recognize the fact that Southeast and Southwest Louisiana are different would actually cause something.
Well, just one thing, and then Nathan, come back. Not just comfortable, but I think that's why white supremacy is the only term that really works, because not just comfortable, but assured as a white person that the reason I'm comfortable is because I'm better and I deserve that. And I just wanted to flag Nell Irvin Painter's book, The History of White People. She puts a lot on Emerson as being the leading intellectual who idolized the British and really made the British like the definition of what everything wonderful is. And I think that is really in our culture, not the Anglophile part of British, but I was astonished because when I think about British people, I think of pasty, kind of passive, not very physically strong. But if you read Emerson, you would think that the British people are, the heroes of the universe. And so that kind of thinking unconsciously is, we who are white are just bred on that. It's not just that I'm comfortable, it's that I should be comfortable because I'm white. And so that's why when people get upset about the word white supremacy, I think what's really upsetting is that we know how true it is. And that is really upsetting because if we believe that it's true, it takes apart a lot of things that we are resting on. And it's scary. But if we don't do that, then we're going, I just choose to live in lies because, we're like the GOP right now, who know that Trump is lying, but support him because it gives him power. That's what we're choosing if we refuse to really be honest about what we're getting. So I just wanted to say that because I've been thinking about that Painter piece about Emerson for a while here. Nathan, you're trying to talk.
I think there's cultural differences within white culture. So part of it is I have a deep theological belief that we should comfort the comfortable because I believe God brings people towards justice, and if we can create the right environment for people, they're going to get there. But so there's a theological reason for me to have that, and part of it is because the people I serve here, white Louisianians and probably white Southerners, they're carrying the nation's guilt the white nation's guilt for slavery. And so here, if you push a little bit, they shut down. Not in the same way that I've seen white people from other parts of the country shut down, but sort of they're here. For me to serve a Southern white person is to say, it's not all your fault, it's actually the country's fault. For them, it's absolutely liberating, because to see ourselves at the bottom of every list, you know, the infant mortality or poverty or whatever, usually those lists are because that's where black people live and this country's decided not to value black people. But it still has an effect on the white people who live there. So the amount of self-directed shame, as if all of this is our fault for white Southerners, is very different than I think people from other parts of the country. And I think there's a way to do racial work in different regions that are just different. And it's not better or worse, it's different. And so I think that's what I meant about, it's for the people I serve, to be able to tell them it's not that scary, let's talk about it. To just get them to see it is the first step here.
But there's a reason there are cultural differences too. And this is why I write so much about history, because part of the reason that the South, or so many white Southerners, get the feeling of carrying the nation's guilt is because I spend enough time in New England, so I can say it this way. New England has conveniently gotten willful amnesia. They just decided that it was the South that did this. Never mind that the reason that Lawrence and Lowell, Massachusetts are Lawrence and Lowell, Massachusetts is because of slavery and all the mills that took all the cotton that slaves picked in the South, they just processed it up north. And so there would be a way to talk about these things. It is the nation's guilt. I mean, I spend roughly half the year in Boston. Let's not forget, the busing riots didn't happen in Atlanta. They happened in Boston. When we talk about our nation's racial history, the things that happened in Atlanta, and very ever so conveniently forget that Boston has its own racial history too, or that New Haven has its own racial history. New York City has its own racial history. I mean, there were riots during the Civil War in New York City. We don't talk about that much, partly because we misremember American history. And it's done purposefully because there is so much pain in it that America being lying to itself is the only way people can survive it. But that only works for one group of people in this country, because the rest of us have been living it for generations and generations and generations, and that amnesia that New England ever so conveniently carries causes death to the rest of us.
Okay, I'm going to change the subject. This has been such a good conversation, but I think all of our phones have been ringing and we've been getting texts during this show because there is breaking news. The beloved, the three co-presidents who send out their beloved towards the beloved community emails sent one out while we were live saying that over $500,000 has been committed to departing staff people recently. And talk of, I'm sorry. I mean, I find that rather astonishing, and I believe their language is disappointing or something like that. But I just need to say flat out that nobody was asked to resign. Nobody was demanded to resign. I've watched many people leave the UUA in many states of being over the years who have not gotten severance packages, who had very significant anguish as they left. without getting this kind of money. I personally got not a cent after 21 years there when I left because I resigned. And I didn't expect it, and I didn't think I should get it. And
how is it legal? That's what I don't understand.
I don't know.
Legal? Because $500,000 without the board we're a 501c3. How and how's this ethical? Yeah. So I'm reacting. I'm gonna mute now so I can react in muteness.
That's why I waited a while to bring it up, because I knew once we heard it, we'd all want to react. But this is a systemic procedure, right? I mean, but I actually think it wasn't from the fact that the 3 co-presidents just discovered it. I think there was not a system in place. It looks to me like the decisions of a few.
And should we read some of the things that our co-presidents said about this?
Sure. Do you want to read it, Michael?
They said, even more than its cost, it is what the pattern of these agreements reveals that requires reflection. The co-presidents see these severance agreements as representing a moral issue, a breach of any reasonable understanding of right relationship, and an example of the culture of white supremacy in operation. I am so thankful for Sophia, for Bill, and for Leon right now leading our association in this brief interim period. I am just so thankful for their willingness to name that publicly in a statement.
Yeah. And to clarify one thing, because some of us know that there's money that a departing president gets, which I think is reasonable in terms of, like, you're not going to go through the search process, right, when you're at the end. I don't know whether it's reasonable or not, but anyway, the $500,000 is in addition to that. That's what this letter says.
Oh yeah, I mean, so Peter Morales is still getting paid, which I have wondered about, because I think if a minister were getting paid and was actively attacking the church that they had left, that there would be a problem with that ethically, which I have experienced Peter to be attacking the UUA since he left. I want to just read what Leslie Mack said, because she said, she's always very clear. Oh, there was a system in place. The system is that white men are protected no matter what. They made these backroom deals away from everyone else, and then all left. It's pure white supremacy. So yes, excuse me, I didn't mean to say there was no system. I meant to say it didn't go through the usual channels of the board and everything, which, yes, this is pure white supremacy, in my opinion, especially to act as if those people had the most suffering of anybody when I know so many people of color who have left the UUA in so many ways. And yeah, it's pure white supremacy. There's no question about it. So I just
not to mention, if we had $500,000 sitting around, I want to question why our justice ministries have been defunded, why our anti-racism programs have been defunded, why identity-based ministries has been slashed, why staff has been slashed. If we had $500,000 just sitting around that we could give to people because they decided to leave the table when things got too hard, it's bullshit. Pardon my friend.
And we didn't. I mean, we have this endowment, right? We have a bunch of endowment. It's just like when the government can't pay for school lunches but buys fighter jets. It's the priorities. Kimberly, you're unmuting. I want to hear what you're going to say.
Well, this is just white boys being white boys. We actually, Michael was asking about how we lost justice ministries and how they're not getting funded. Let's be real about that. I have no shame in saying Peter didn't want them, and he found an easy way to get rid of them, which is not to pay for them. It's really easy to sit up and say that you are for anti-racism work, but if you don't put money behind it, it doesn't get done, because white boys will be white boys, and it's going to go for themselves first. This is the history of America. What's going on in the UUA right now is the history of America writ small. That when confronted with the things they have done, white boys run away. They don't stand up and stay in the fight. They run away like cowards, because that is what they did. Everybody, as somebody who was in the room in Baltimore when Peter got asked the question about hiring practices, I can tell you that nobody in that room, as far as I could see, pretty good view of that room, nobody in that room ever said that Peter should resign, mainly because none of us are stupid. We knew he was coming to the end of his term anyway. None of us would have been so stupid as to call for Peter to resign, because in 10 weeks, his resignation, most of us would have known, was going to cause the upheaval that it caused. So none of us are that dumb. We were all religious professionals in that room. Peter made a choice to resign. I'm actually kind of upset that he's still getting paid, because if I resign from a job, I'd lose my check. If I don't finish a job, I don't get paid fully for it. But yet, white boys being white boys, Peter's still getting paid. How about he sends some of that money my way, or to Leslie Mack and to Lena and to the Blue Organizing Collective, who are ours to help provide pastoral support and all kinds of supports for Black UUs who are going to be in New Orleans next week. Why is he getting that money? This makes no sense to me. But of course, this is America, and I'm just a Black woman. And so it's not supposed to make sense to me, because this is people trying to hit straight licks with crooked sticks. This doesn't work for me. But I will shut up now and let somebody else talk.
Well, I do want to add, I'd like for us to pay attention to what we do to distract us from talking about race, and specifically Black issues. So the more we got close to talking about race at last year's General Assembly, the more we wanted to argue about the Boy Scouts or Thanksgiving, or divesting from Israel, despite the fact that we divested. The more we started to actually, it would seem like, get traction in this country about getting, at least acknowledging that Black people are being killed by police, our country went ahead and elected someone, which would force us to shift our focus towards immigrants and Muslims. And not that they shouldn't be protected, but we're always going to find some way to avoid talking about Black people and race. And so I just encourage us to look at General Assembly, what are the ways that we're avoiding looking directly at what we need to look at?
Amen.
Aisha, you got a comment now, or are you still speechless?
Well, I think, thank you, Nathan, for that. Thank you, Kimberly. This is such a great conversation. And I think part of, yes, I affirm what you're saying, like, let's not avoid talking about race. And within that context, why this money is so outrageous to, I'm going to guess, 3 men, $500,000, is because people have also been incredibly vocal against money that has been committed to blue. That's the racial part of it. How come 3 white men, or 1 man of color and 2 white men, can get that significant amount of money? And Scott Taylor was there, what, 3 years, maybe 4? I left after 3 years. I got a beautiful chalice and a book. I did not get $10,000 or 20 or 100. So what is it about our system that we're fighting against money for Black lives of Unitarian Universalism, but somehow in our system, and it sounds like from what you read, Michael, that thank heavens for our 3 Crow presidents who named it, this is a moral, really I don't think they use the word moral failing, but it is an incredible moral failing, and a direct symptom, a direct white supremacy, example of white supremacy. So I can go on, so I'm not going to, because we're after 9. Thank
Amen.
you.
We're at time. I know that this conversation is going to continue. I believe that it will. be part of a very lively exchange at General Assembly next week. We'll be broadcasting live next week, and then we'll be gone for the summer, so you can enjoy some of the podcast. I want to shout out a thanks to Terri Burnor, who's been doing tech for the last period of time and really has ramped up the podcast piece of this. And also thanks very much to our special guests. That was really good to have you here to process breaking news with, especially, but also just to hear, you know, and Kimberly, someday I want to take a history class that you teach. It's like I said, in St. Louis, you knew stuff I couldn't find in books, and I'd love to hear it. All right, see y'all soon.